In the current landscape of modern animation, audiences tend to take creative freedom and lack of studio restraint for granted. These days you can have shows intended for children able to explore complicated concepts for entertainment that is intended for a young audience, and push the boundaries of what the art form of animation is capable of. Pendleton Ward, J.G. Quintel, Alex Hirsch, Brian Konechko, Michael Dante DiMartino, Rebecca Sugar, and Gendy Tartakovsky are all names that stand out when talking about great advancement and achievement in animation, thanks to the creative freedom given to them and loosening of studio censorship. But it wasn't always this way. Unlike film, which experienced its golden age in the late 60s, TV animation had been under its own kind of studio system until around the late 80s and early 90s. Before that point, animation on TV in the West was primarily designed to do two things, that being to sell merchandise and to be as safe as non-controversial as possible. However, that all changed in 1990 with the founding of Nickelodeon's animation studio, a network that existed to be the near antithesis to everything animation was supposed to be before Nick's conception. Where some networks rejected anything that could be seen as even remotely controversial and alienating, Nick would be the one to pick it up, saying that no idea is too weird.
I took it everywhere. I took it to NBC, ABC, Fox, you name it, every network in the world, and they all turned it down, said it was too weird, too disgusting, don't ever come back. So finally we took it to Nickelodeon, and they said, well, it's too disgusting, but we kind of like some disgusting stuff, and they went for it.
Before, producers and executives drove the creative vision and direction of cartoons, but with Nick, that power was put into the hands of the creatives that made it and not the suits that supervised it. This crafted many good to great shows, Ren and Stimpy, Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Rocko's Modern Life, and so on. But whenever I think of Nickelodeon and the great things it brought to the world of animation, I think of two things. One of them is one of the most revered pieces of Western animation that is loved by millions across the globe, renowned for its characters, storytelling, and intricate thought-provoking philosophy. And the other one is Zim. Invader Zim is without a doubt one of my favourite animated shows of all time. While Avatar The Last Airbender is an amazing show that transcends the barrier between live-action television that is intended for adults and animated programming made for a much younger audience, I just have more of an attachment and nostalgia towards Zim. It's not exactly as thought-provoking or ingeniously designed as Avatar, but that doesn't mean it's any less valuable or great. I first discovered Zim when I was 10 years old, around 7 years after it was cancelled, and ever since watching it for the first time, it's been a personal favourite of mine. But when I recently re-watched the show again with a more critical lens than what I had when I was a worthless fucking child, I discovered that Zim is a lot more dense than I had originally thought. There are so many different layers to the show that make it work as well as it does, and the story and factors behind its inception, production, and cancellation are really interesting, especially when you consider what kind of show it was. But what kind of show was it, you ask? Well, let me weave you the tale of Zim's origin. Invader Zim was the love child of Jhonen Vasquez, and at the time 20-something from California. Before creating Zim, Jhonen was a student in film at De Anza College, but dropped out to work primarily as a comic book writer and illustrator for a very small and unknown publisher called Slave Labor Graphics, where he created his first comic book, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. The comic explored a very loose and directionless exploration of Johnny, and manifestations of all the aspects of Jhonen's personality that he hated about himself at the time. Johnny is an irrational, easily irritated, nihilistic insomniac, which were key aspects of Jhonen's personality at the time. Not to get too far ahead of myself, but a key theme of Jhonen Vasquez's work is how every character is either a highly exaggerated version of himself or a flanderized depiction of someone he's met. Johnny represents Jhonen's hypnophobia taken to such an extreme that he kills people out of his inability to express himself artistically, turning to murder to satisfy the most bizarre and corrupted form of a creative itch. The book's art style was certainly very striking, utilizing a way more jagged and dirty kind of aesthetic than his later work. There is no doubt that Johnny's tone is overtly horrific, what with its pure black and white colour palette, lack of any real symmetry or graphical perspective, and there's a whole lot of killing and a whole lot of gore. The book never leaves a moment of quiet or downtime between panels for you to take in what you've just read and process the sheer, unimaginable, existential dread and abhorrence you've just witnessed. And I think Johnny is one of the bleakest things I've ever read. No character gets a happy ending, and there is never a moment where you feel at any point joyful. Johnny's world is permeated with cynicism, agony, and neglect. Johnny is a suicidal serial killer. Even his kid neighbor Squee has a miserable existence, son to two parents that hate him and either ignore his existence or condemn it. The dialogue is very weird, but in a good way. No one would talk the same way as they would in real life. Almost every character goes into a large monologue when it's their time to speak, or they'll just outright describe their emotions. In most media this would be bad, Show not telling all that. But it works for Johnny because of two reasons. One, it adds to the horror and unease of the book when almost every character, Johnny in particular, blurts out their emotions and thoughts in an incredibly quick and fluent way. 2. It further reinforces the book's feeling of being written by an insomniac who's running on caffeine and his own depraved imagination, writing whatever comes to his mind in the moment with a very haphazard approach. This is all irrelevant, I swear. After creating Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, Jhonen made a few spin-offs of the series, the most notable of which being Squee, a short mini-series following the hilarious escapades of a lovable little boy from Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. You get to see him get abducted by aliens, you get to see his friend get mauled by a dog, and you get to see a 100+ wholesome moment where he becomes friends with the Antichrist. So business as usual for Mr. Jhonen Vasquez, drawing comics of children getting maimed and casual existential nihilism. That was until a call came in. A representative from Nickelodeon by the name of Mary Harrington approached Jhonen asking him if he had ideas for a cartoon for the network. Weirdly, she was interested in picking up Squee for the network.
They were interested in Squee initially. I think because it looks like, cute, like kids sort of stuff, which it's not.
Squee, like Johnny, is one of the bleakest things I've read. The opening of the comic has two aliens arguing over who gets to dissect and experiment on Squee. Jhonen has his own theory of why Harrington was interested in Squee. I think she saw a certain amount of kid relatability, mainly in the way I handled the kids and the way Squee's behaviour was an overall mood. I don't think anyone would ever want to make Squee into a kid's show. I don't think anyone would be that insane, but I think she liked the way I handled the characters and the way there was actual character as opposed to just sick humour. That night, Jhonen developed the concept for Zim in about an hour or two while in bed. It's about an incompetent alien outcast coming to Earth to try and invade it but failing at every turn. Boom, perfect elevator pitch. Something important to note is that besides a short time as a film student and a couple of comic books under his belt, Jhonen was grossly underqualified to be working on an animated TV show. Sure, he could draw, but other than that, he knew next to nothing about the process in making a show, how to animate, and working with a group of people to develop a single product.
Because I had no idea how to work in animation, how to run a show. I just said, sure, because I thought it'd be fun.
But despite Jhonen having no experience and making up his pitch pretty much at the last minute, Mary Harrington and the folks at Nickelodeon decided to propel the show forward and for Jhonen to begin creating the show proper. After moving to LA, Vasquez was able to fully commit to Zim and even made a pilot for the series, which had tested well, leading to Nickelodeon picking up the show for a full series. Jhonen never expected the show to go any further than its pilot. He initially made Invader Zim to be something that, if it was turned down, he wouldn't be too disappointed with, but as he continued to work on the show, he became more and more attached to the concept and characters. And I think this stems from what I said earlier, that Jhonen draws on his own personal interests and anxieties from when he was younger, and develops the characters using exaggerated aspects of his personality. It made the show personal to him and something that he wanted to continue pursuing. Jhonen's style of writing has always been the most bizarre and hyperbolic interpretation of writing what you know. Johnny is an excessive depiction of an artist taking his insecurities and lack of satisfaction with his creative process to the extreme. Squee represents the lack of respect and agency a child is regarded with, and Invader Zim encapsulates a lot of aspects of Jhonen's personality. Characters like Dib represents Jhonen's obsession with the paranormal and his desire to be proven right from when he was younger. Zim represents Jhonen's arrogance and unwillingness to compromise despite what logic and reason would dictate. And bear in mind, Zim and Dib are not good people. Zim being uncompromising and Dib being hellbent on exposing Zim are never portrayed as positive traits. Zim gets sent on a suicide mission to a buttfuck nowhere planet because his leadership and fellow invaders can't stand him. And Dib is viewed as insane by everyone, including his own family, and is even sent to a mental ward in one episode. A lot of people will see the Nickelodeon logo on the Blu-ray and just assume, oh, this is a kiddie fun for all families type thing. But no, Zim is like a nightmare at times. Jhonen said that he didn't really have to change his writing style much for Zim aside from restricting language and violence, and that's pretty apparent in the show. There really isn't that much difference between someone like Johnny's writing compared to Zim. The show is still pretty bleak and horrific. although admittedly not to the same extent as Johnny. The interpretation of Earth we see in Zim is an almost dystopian world where apathy and consumerism run rampant, and humans are nothing more than brainless cattle whose lives are insignificant and disposable. It may make me sound like an incredibly pretentious video essay dickhead who likes the smell of his own farts when I say stuff like that, but Zim genuinely radiates a lot of anti-capitalist energy.
Our whole society is nothing more than a perilous house of cards, destined to collapse under its own weight.
Maybe it's not so much that it's being anti-capitalism, but more just anti-American culture. You got episodes satirizing fast food.
Seeing this as a way to end their streak of being sued by angry customers poisoned by their burgers, the McBeaties Corporation decided to try this miraculous space speed. Not having access to that technology, we make ours out of napkins.
Gaming culture.
Completed more mini quests than are even in the game! That's how I know I'm pretty much the master of all reality and all that encompasses it.
And government elections.
Candidates' popularity will be monitored by audience brain scan. A drop in popularity will result in a horrible electric shock.
Debate now or suffer!
I don't really think Zim's a biting satire of these kind of topics. I think it's more just taking the piss out of concepts that at their core are ridiculous. No solutions are given and no lesson is learned. It's just kind of the way the world is, and it's fun to laugh at it when it's pushed to such a ludicrous extreme. Tying into that, episodes never end on a positive note, often outright taking the piss out of and satirizing the writing of traditional kids cartoons that have a similar setup of an alien coming to Earth and learning about human culture. You got an episode where Zim tries to make a best friend with a kid at school. Aww, 100 plus wholesome. But then Zim fucking tears out the kid's eyes when he's outlived his usefulness. Then there's another episode where Zim has to sell chocolate for a school fundraiser, but he's having trouble selling them. So he goes to a house where you got kids shoving a pile of what's meant to be cockroaches into their mouths, and their parents being shown a nightmare world full of death and despair to make them buy the chocolate out of fear. No character gets a moment of victory. Dib never succeeds in exposing Zim. Every time you think he just might be able to get something on Zim, it all ends up coming crashing down by something that's completely out of his control.
Oh well, at least I have something recorded on disc. It wasn't a total loss.
Hell, he even dies in one episode. Even though Jhonen was restricted by network standards, he still tried to work his way around these restrictions and sneak in as much death as possible. However, the network always demanded that the episodes in which characters die feature something to show the audience that they are alive. Oftentimes, the team's alterations were quite patronizing mockeries of the studio's restrictions, like the end of Hamstergeddon, which featured a very sarcastic message reading, "No animated characters were killed in the filming of this production," as that episode undoubtedly featured the highest death count.
The city, but they all agree he's just fuzzy wuzzy adorable, isn't he? He sure is.
Unless you include Planet Jackers. There's also the episode where Gaz kills a gamer for being annoying.
You'll never be a better gamer than me. Play all you want. I'll always be better.
Where it's revealed he actually survived the elevator crash. Despite network restrictions, Zim always found a way to sneak in deaths to satisfy the bloodlust of the Johnny audience. The dialogue is also very Johnny-esque. Characters often blurt out their emotions, there's some weird vocabulary, and it's very sporadic and hyperactive. However, there were definitely a lot of distinct changes in Jhonen's writing after making the change from writing comics to a more visual medium like television. Characters don't quite monologue as much as they used to in Johnny and Squee. The dialogue is a lot more to the point, with a lot of simpler exchanges as opposed to speeches that can go on for about a minute or two from Johnny. Just something that comes with going from making a comic by yourself with a complete creative freedom to working in a studio setting restricted to writing 11-minute episodes for a kids TV show. And Jhonen didn't do the show by himself like with Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. He had a team working with him who he was more than willing to have pitch in ideas. Jhonen wasn't a person that particularly cared about what would be successful or what would connect with children to ensure this show's longevity. One of the only reasons he wanted to do a show for Nickelodeon was because he thought it would be fun.
Back then, we had people coming in working from like other kids shows, and then they're on this thing and they're like, what is this? To see them just kind of open up and go, oh, I can do this? Just seeing the enthusiasm, seeing people kind of light up at what they could do now. Having people come in and pitch ideas that were not Rugrats appropriate. And I'd be like, yeah, that sounds great.
Every member of the production had a say in what they would like to see in the show, and no ideas were off limits to Jhonen. If there was a seemingly weird and out of place gag in an episode, it was more than likely just something that was put in because a crew member thought it'd be funny.
Zim was so fun because, unlike the sitcom shows I had worked on, where in 22 minutes you'd be lucky if you could squeeze one of your own visual jokes in, the writers were like, ruled the show with an iron fist, and anything that they didn't write you weren't really allowed to put in. So also we worked with the writers in the same area, so you could walk over to the writer and talk to them, get clarification, say that you had an idea, a different way to do the scene than maybe what was written, and there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more respect between the writers and the artists.
Zim was able to get away with a lot. Nickelodeon didn't hire Jhonen because they thought he'd be a good candidate for making content aimed at 5 to 7 year olds. At the time, Nickelodeon was trying to experiment a bit more of its programming to reach wider demographics. Invader Zim was one of these shows. It was to be the first of a block of shows aimed primarily at ages 11 to 15. So the crew were able to do what Doug couldn't, and make episodes on some really fucked up or bizarre ideas. As a former film student, Jhonen drew a lot of his storytelling inspiration from horror directors like David Cronenberg. Episodes like Bolognius Maximus were written to be a homage to classic body horror films like The Fly. The infamous episode Dark Harvest is built around the concept of Zim harvesting organs from kids and teachers to appear more human. Jhonen's horror influence in conjunction with Zim's manic style and pace is one that works very well for an 11-minute episode of a horror comedy. Everything's straight to the point and tonally consistent. Even when there are moments that are put in for the sake of it with no real bearing on the plot, the show never feels like it's wasting its time. It's something that could only work as well as it does with Jhonen at the helm. Him just wanted to make stuff that he thought would be fun without much consideration for greater continuity was definitely the right decision for what the show would be. One change from Johnny's writing style that I like is that there's a lot more reprieve from the constant barrage of jokes and screaming. There's a lot of parts in Zim where no dialogue is spoken, and it uses the fact that the show is visual to its advantage and creates some of the funniest parts of the show through its use of animation and sound design. Zim's look and animation is one of the most easily recognizable and revered parts of the show. Jhonen's signature drawing style that was established in previous work like Johnny and Squee is still very present in Zim. Everything in Zim's world is murky, jagged, non-symmetrical and distorted. However, you can tell the style definitely has been neutered down to be more conducive to animating for TV from what it was in Johnny or even Zim's original test pilot. Zim looked a lot more Johnny-like in the pilot, and if I was given the choice between the pilot style and the actual shows, I would choose the pilot style. It just looks more appealing in that gross Vasquez sort of way, and something that would have been very striking from an image standpoint. But wanting that for the show would be unrealistic and would cancel out so many aspects of the show's animation, mainly because the style that ended up being used for the show was already complex enough for storyboard artists and animators overseas to try and grasp. Animators who have worked on Zim often describe it as the most difficult style they've ever had to learn. The co-creator of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Brian Konechko, who was a storyboard artist and art director at the time for Zim, had to fly all the way to Korea to help the animators master the style. Having Zim's art style resemble Johnny more also would have restricted the quality of animation. Most animated shows tend to use around 80 to 120 pages for their storyboards. It works for when your show is focused on basic movement and actions, and it's easier for the animators, but for Zim, pages for storyboards were around 250 to 350 pages long, as so much emphasis was put into the exaggerated movement of the characters.
The show was probably the most difficult show I've ever worked on. The level of quality to everything that Jhonen and the whole crew wanted and expected was much higher, and with the amount of money and the time that we had and we were given, we were able to make an amazing product, but it was very, very hard to do. It was creative minds and business minds sort of wrestling all at the same time.
Zim had a ludicrously high budget for its animation. In my research, I haven't been able to find an exact confirmed number, but several sources estimate that the average budget for an episode of Invader Zim was around $1.2 million. And if that's true, then the team clearly took full advantage of that. Zim was groundbreaking for its fusion of 3D and 2D animation. At that point, the only 2D animated show that incorporated CG elements into its animation was Futurama, and the crew who worked on it were very impressed with Zim's incorporation of CG. 3D elements elements were used fairly often in Zim. They were used in the show's opening and also to complement action or to convey a sense of scale. It may look somewhat dated now, but I will never not be impressed with how this show looks. The look of Zim perfectly complements its setup, that being an Earth where capitalism, apathy and ignorance run rampant in a nearly dystopian type of setting. Everything has this industrial, grimy look. Pipes and wires are sprouting out of every street corner, every structure looks crudely built with corrugated metal. TV screens are everywhere and there's such a huge overall emphasis on automation and machinery. Every character suits the world really well. Some have got stitches from where they've been lobotomized, some are missing limbs, and a few have even got cybernetics attached to them. Zim utilizes unique character design that you ain't gonna find in any other cartoon. Jhonen designs every character with a few constant rules to keep them looking uniquely Zim. Those being big heads on top of small or elongated bodies, sharp edges, and thick black outlines. But fuck the look of the show. Of course it's gonna look cool. I mean, the creator drew comics for a living. Let's talk more about how Zim utilizes sound. Throughout this video I've been using bits and pieces of Invader Zim soundtrack, which was done by Kevin Manthe, a man who hasn't really done anything notable besides Sim. I mean, unless you count Johnny Test, or the video game adaptation of Shrek 2. If it wasn't clear already, Jhonen Vasquez is not a person that likes to do what is expected of him, or someone who cares about making art which has as broad an appeal as possible. Most of the people Jhonen got to work on Zim were underdogs in the industry, as Jhonen felt like having too big of names would both compromise what the show is trying to achieve and also make it harder to watch without thinking about the person behind the art. Kevin definitely fell under the underdog category and was approached for the job because he hadn't done anything notable beforehand. However, notoriety is not indicative of skill, and Jhonen knew this, so he gave Kevin the freedom to just kind of do what he wanted with the soundtrack and left what kind of direction it would go in up to his discretion.
In this project it was always, you know, number one, it's got to be a score, it's got to work with the emotions and what's going on, and then after that we want to encompass all these different styles of music.
Now, full disclosure, I am not a music guy in the slightest. There's so many terms I don't know, and I wouldn't know a leitmotif if it bit me in the ass. I'm not sideways. I just know that the music sounds great and perfectly complements the show. Kevin is clearly a man who knows what he's doing and perfectly comprehends the kind of show he's working on.
I mean, this cue is just like straight ahead horror. It was just like, I just thought to myself, I'll just write like the scariest music I can possibly write. And forget the fact that it's for a cartoon or whatever. I just didn't even think, that didn't even cross my mind.
I really like the synth/techno style. There's a lot of cool blends of instruments, and I love all the different genres that make up Zim's score. You got horror, action, and weird zany stuff. So yeah, Zim's soundtrack is a standout part of Zim's signature sound, taking an underdog composer and letting him flex his creative muscles, much like Jhonen did for Zim's voice cast, who were similarly underdogs in the industry. Once again, Jhonen didn't want to get people who were well known to voice the characters on Zim, mainly because he found it distracting as an audience member watching a film featuring a well-known actor, as more often than not you tend to see the actor before you see the character. So to not break the immersion, Jhonen tried to get as many unknown or underrated actors as possible to voice the characters in Zim. When casting for the role of Gur, Jhonen grew frustrated with actors trying to put on a zany voice for Gur when they saw the character and thought, oh, I'll just do a crazy voice. Jhonen didn't want someone who would be too professional voicing Gur, as Gur's character was that he was a defective little robot that was made from literal trash. So it would suit the character more to have him be voiced by somebody who had no idea what he's doing. Enter Ricky Simmons, a close friend of Jhonen's who was actually brought onto Zim to work on colour. According to Jhonen, Ricky had a naturally funny voice, and since he had no prior acting experience, he sounded kinda shitty, which was perfect for Gur. On top of that, Jhonen liked the the idea of having people who had voices that, in their day-to-day lives, would have them stand out and sound irregular, as he felt they'd be the perfect voice for the show. Another notable voice actor in this regard to work on Zim was Richard Stephen Horvitz, who voiced the title character. Although he wasn't originally meant to voice Zim, he was actually the last out of 3 voice actors to be offered the role, the first being everybody's favourite milk guzzler, Mark Hamill. Hamill is an incredibly accomplished actor who's responsible for playing so many great roles and giving memorable performances of those characters, but he really would have been the wrong choice for Zim.
I'm willing to bet one of my hearts that you are wondering why I am not more disturbed by this news.
Zim's character is that he's an incredibly arrogant and incompetent idiot who never gives a second thought to anything he does. I think Hamill gets the arrogant part down, but he sounds too methodical. Hamill works well when cast as an evil genius, and that's how he's playing Zim.
It is obvious that the others of your kind do not believe you. Do not believe you. And that they are too fooled by my disguise to figure out on their own.
But that's just not who Zim is. He's the opposite of that. I love you, Mark, but I'm sorry, you weren't well suited for the role. Billy West, on the other hand, could have worked pretty well. There are points in the pilot where I thought he sounded just like Horvitz's interpretation of the character.
I eat food, just like you.
My only issue with him in the role would be that it's a little uncanny, mainly because I'm so used to hearing Horvitz's voice coming out of Zim's mouth, and hearing somebody that almost sounds like him but not really is just bizarre.
Nonsense. I love beans.
I love them.
The reason Jhonen hired Horvitz for the role was because he felt Billy West was too much of an established name for the show.
Well, at the time, the only reason that we didn't go with Billy West was that his voice was a little too familiar at the time to me. I thought I associated him with another science fiction comedy show, which was Futurama. So I thought, who can I find that just is not at all a well-received voice actor? Someone who's just going to not remind anyone of anyone else, any other character, because they didn't leave an impression on the minds of the audience.
Horvitz is the perfect choice for Zim. His voice just naturally suits the role and he perfectly understands his character. Horvitz and every other actor was able to experiment a bit with their performances. Whilst Jhonen wanted the voice acting to be done a certain way, he was open to having the actors fuck around with their performances a bit, and would even leave in parts where the actors fuck up their lines.
Invader's blood marches through my veins like giant radioactive rubber pants!
In the pilot episode, the original line was, Invader's blood marches through my veins like giant radioactive rubber ants. And I accidentally said rubber pants, and that's how it became rubber pants. Jones said, I like that better, let's do that. So, I mean, that was sort of...
There's probably a lot more I can talk about in regard to Zim's voice acting, but I don't want to risk repeating myself. I just really like it. It all fits and the voice actors are just having fun with it. And that's the overall vibe you get from Zim. You can tell that everyone who worked on the show had a lot of fun with it. It wasn't a show where the writers ran the joint and all the little underlings in charge getting the coffee had no say. Jhonen, being a young goth 20-something, was key to Zim's critical success and would not have worked as well if it was run by somebody who was obsessed with pleasing demographics. So, given all the praise I've given Zim, that begs the question of, is the show perfect? Fuck no, it's not. I may have spent the last however many minutes singing the show's praises, but I'd be an idiot to say if it didn't have flaws. So let's play Mortos' advocate and talk about some of the stuff in Zim that I don't like. Firstly, while this isn't necessarily a problem with the show given the format and schedule of which it was distributed, this show is draining to watch multiple episodes of at a time. When I first started rewatching the show for this video, I was laughing pretty consistently. I was rufflecoptering all over the fucking place. But it's something that's clearly meant to be experienced in bite-sized chunks. There's only so many jokes about pigs I can take before I start to get sick of it. The fact that the show's writing is so spontaneous helps to alleviate this, I must admit. The jokes about Dib's head don't usually get old.
Why is his head so big? Why is his head so big?
But for the most part, it is really draining, and I think the best and only way to watch the show is for you to watch only about an episode or two per week. Also, I'm someone who doesn't usually care for loud equals funny type humour, and Gur is the encapsulation of that. He's the fucking avatar of all that is wrong with this show's sense of humour. I know he's a fan favourite and on all the cringy Hot Topic shirts, but I rarely find anything he says or does funny. I mostly just find it tiring. Some would argue, oh, that's the point. But there's a difference between a character who's annoying to the people within its world and a character that's annoying to the audience. However, I must admit, he isn't all mad. Sometimes he fulfills his function well, and there are some jokes from him I actually find funny.
A hunter-destroyer A hunter-destroyer. What is it? A hunter-destroyer machine.
I think he works well as a sort of straight man to Zim who questions some of his stupid ideas.
You are no commander. You are a threat to the mission. Your methods are stupid. Your progress has been stupid. Your intelligence is stupid.
But for the most part, I find him to be mostly irritating. There's also some weird technical issues in the show. Some of the audio sounds really highly compressed, especially for Dib.
Theory involving replacing human blood with tiny coffee beans.
And while the fusion of 2D and 3D is incredibly ambitious and impressive, it does look very dated when compared to modern standards. But that's really about as far as complaints go. I still really like the show despite these mostly personal complaints. And it is still a bit of a bummer that it got cancelled. Oh yeah, I should probably talk about that. In January of 2002, Nickelodeon announced that they were planning on cancelling Invader Zim. Zim's cancellation is one of the biggest mysteries of the series, as no official reasoning was given by Nick as to why they were cancelling the show. There are several theories about why Zim was cancelled. The dumbest one out of all of them is centered around Bloody Gur. Bloody Gur was an image that was rumored to have been made for the episode Gur Goes Crazy and Stuff, which Nickelodeon of course rejected given how inappropriate for kids the image is. So the staff smuggled the image into a few episodes, starting with Bad Bad Rubber Piggy. This is all real, by the way. Bloody Gur is an actual thing that exists, which you can easily find by pausing at specific frames in certain episodes. This isn't some creepypasta bullshit. Bloody Gur isn't gonna leap out and kill you or whatever. It's just a thing that exists, and the only theory around its inception is just what it was made for. But people think that Nick found Bloody Gur and was so morally outraged that they decided to cancel the show because of it, which is dumb. In actuality, Nick was fully aware of Bloody Gur's existence and just didn't care, seeing as they were so hidden that no little kid could see it unless they paused on an unfortunate frame. The most likely culprit was poor ratings. Zim was meant to be a part of a new block of shows aimed at 11 to 15 year olds, but that block of shows never manifested, as by the time Zim entered production, Nickelodeon had abandoned the idea and awkwardly slotted it during a time when the audience watching would be around 2 to 11, which Zim was obviously not intended for. So as a result, the show suffered in the ratings. Add on top of that the ridiculous cost for each episode and the fact that the show was mired in controversy. Zim came out at a really bad time. The world was facing a really miserable point in its life in the early 2000s, and in the thick of it you had a show that was openly nihilistic and mocked the idea of capitalist nations like America at a time where the 9/11 attacks happened. You also had the show's deuteragonist wearing a trench coat resembling that of the Columbine murderers, and the show was incredibly violent, with Dark Harvest being pointed to as inspiring a serial killer for giving him a fascination with body parts. Then you've got a show that just isn't profitable to keep around, so why wouldn't you cancel it? But the question is, did I want Zim to continue its run and be saved from an early grave? Not really, no. The show had its time and it lived a good life. Of course, there were a lot of episodes that went unfinished and even a cancelled made-for-TV movie, but the show didn't have a story to wrap up like Samurai Jack, and it didn't end on a cliffhanger like something like Young Justice. The episodes we got were good, and I'd rather it be fantastic for 2 seasons rather than let it slowly get worse and then succumb to seasonal rot. So I guess to wrap this all up in a nice little bow, I think Invader Zim is a fantastic show that, despite its shortcomings, excelled by being the ultimate expression of creative freedom from not just its creator but everyone involved. Every aspect of the show radiates personality, from its writing, music, aesthetic and animation, all the way to its voice acting, and that personality makes it unique. In addition to the show's craft, you get something that you're just not going to find anywhere else. Nick taking a chance on Jhonen Vasquez when they had no reason to was one of the best things that they could have done, and it should have set the precedent in the industry to give young people with talent the tools and the opportunity to create whatever they wanted. I mean, shit's just cool, man.
The fact that they just took a chance on someone that a lot of people wouldn't have given a kid's show to is one of the coolest things that ever happened to me in my life. I'm super thankful. I like when I can see an actual personality in someone's work. When I watch other shows, I want to feel the person coming through. That's my favorite stuff. I want to see that they're making something that could only have come from them and looks like them and sounds like them. It's important to stand back and realize how lucky I am being given the opportunity to do that. That's the dream.